Okay, so here at the Gender Critical Research Network, we've set it up as a space for thoughtful, respectful and robust academic debate on issues of sex and gender. So disagreement is welcome, but anybody using hostile, degrading or insulting language will be ejected from the seminar. The nature of our topic necessitates using sex-based language such as male and female, but please do be mindful of the sensitive nature of these topics and help us to maintain a respectful and open academic space. I'm sure you all would anyway. So we've got three brilliant speakers today, starting with we're going to speak for kind of 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll take questions at the end. So if you have questions for the earlier speakers, please note them down and then bring them after all three have finished. And we're starting with Rose Rickford, who is a PhD candidate at York University, who's going to be talking about social constructionism, ontology, and sex denial. So I'll pass over to Rose.
Hi everyone, thank you so much, Laura, and thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Brilliant. And can you see my slides?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you. As Laura said, I'm a sociology PhD student at the University of York. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I'm going to present a methodological argument today in which I consider how it has come to be the case that social sciences, particularly qualitative social sciences, have managed to be so captured by the idea that sex is a priori never significant for helping us understand what's happening in society, or even that sex doesn't exist at all. I'll argue that a dualistic approach to methodology and the dominance of social constructionist epistemology in particular has a lot to answer for, and I'll be explaining where I think constructionism goes wrong and how we might think about research differently. So before I go any further, I need to distinguish between two different uses of the term social constructionism. Social scientists have used the term social construct to make an ontological claim that certain objects in the social world, such as institutions and concepts, are socially constructed, i.e. created by humans in the course of our interactions with one another and with objects in the world. In this context, to say that something is socially constructed doesn't mean it isn't real, it just means it's been created socially. This is distinct from, but often muddled up with, epistemological social constructionism or constructivism, which is closely related to relativism and is the argument that we cannot access a real world out there and that all knowledge is therefore constructed in here, in our minds, in arbitrary relationship with anything beyond itself. This form of social constructionism sets itself up in opposition to positivism, which comes from Comte's positive philosophy and is, to put a very broad brushstroke on it, the idea that social sciences can and should aim to uncover law-like generalizations about how the social world works. Positivism calls on the social researcher to try to remove their own values and perspectives in order to seek the truth as it really is. But nearly 50 years ago, Giddens pointed out that positivism isn't actually a term any social scientist uses to describe themselves. Despite this, positivism is routinely presented to students as the paradigm that all others are defined in opposition to. I'm yet to find a qualitative methodology textbook that doesn't present positivism first, before anything else. They critique it as epistemologically naive and ontologically simplistic and unsuitable for qualitative research, and then present constructionism as a suitable alternative. My take on this is that by presenting constructionism in opposition to a straw man positivism, sociology is steering students towards social constructionism. We're witnessing a decline in uptake of quantitative methods and constructionism as the dominant paradigm for qualitative research. Epistemological social constructionism assumes that knowledge does not have a meaningful relationship to any real world out there. It's a logical next step from there to suggest that our reality is created by our constructions of it. And the next step from there is that we can therefore change that reality by changing how we construct it. This is the claim made by Kenneth Gergen in his highly influential book, An Invitation to Social Construction, which has 3 editions and has been cited over 8,000 times. For students steered towards social constructionism, his work is an obvious starting point, so I want to look at a bit more detail at the things that he claims. To begin with, accounts are partial. This is true. There's always more than one possible way of talking about anything, and if we're describing something, there'll always be things we choose to include and things we choose to leave out. If I were to describe my desk to you, I could say it's white with a rectangular top of an area of approximately 1 square metre. Or I could say that it has a mug, a pen, a candle, a computer, and some other things on it. Gergen takes this observation about partial accounts and extrapolates from it that because they're partial, accounts are not reliable. Now, the thing is, both the descriptions I provided were true. They were different, but neither of them was wrong. Gergen's own example is of a black and white photograph. He tells us that his grandson made the mistake of thinking that because old photos are in black and white, the scene that was being photographed must also have been in black and white. You might think that a reasonable conclusion from this is that photographs only provide a partial account of something, and that young children don't yet fully understand how photographs work. But that's not what Gergen concludes. He points out that black and white photographs are used as evidence in trials, despite not depicting colour. Now, I would wager that a black and white photograph would not be used in a trial as evidence of the colour of someone's shoes. But he claims that because a photograph is not an exact copy of the reality that was taking place when it was taken, but is used as a record, means that whether a photo tells us the truth about an object is a matter of social agreement. Photos are not exact copies of life. Nothing is an exact copy of life. All accounts are partial accounts, but this does not mean they have no relationship to the world in which they are made. Linguistic communication relies on shared terms of reference. This is another claim, and it's also true. In order to communicate in language, we have to share language in common. It works through intersubjectivity. My ability to use it to interact with you relies on your ability to understand what I am saying. But Gergen thinks that because words are only useful for conveying meaning if the understanding of their meaning is shared between people, whether a statement is true or false relies on shared understanding of the meaning of the words. Basically, if I say the world is round, but I say it in a language that you don't understand, the statement the world is round is no longer true. Understandings of reality are developed intersubjectively. Again, this is correct. We rely upon one another's perceptions in order to check our own perceptions. If we are uncertain of our own perception of something, the first thing we're likely to do is ask someone else for their perception. But for Gergen, this means that nothing is true unless it is agreed upon, and anything that is agreed upon is true. He suggests that if we all agree that our souls leave this earth when we die and rise up to heaven in the sky, that will make it so. We do develop understandings intersubjectively, but we do it in relation to shared reference. Mostly we can tell whether our perceptions are shared by others without having to check. When I arrive in a cafe I've never been in before, I don't need to ask the other customers whether they can see the chairs. I know they can by virtue of the fact that they are sitting in them. A final claim is that social constructions affect how we understand reality. This is also true. Concepts are socially constructed, and they affect how we understand reality. Socially constructed concepts include marriage, universities, race, biscuits, love, justice, jogging, and hydrangeas. These concepts help us to understand and interact with the world we actually live in, and we use them to grasp aspects of that world and communicate about them. But Gergen tells us that the fact that concepts are constructed means that we can talk the world into being whatever we want it to be. Truth is only a matter of social agreement. So if everyone agrees about something, it will literally become true. For Gergen, this is liberatory, because we, the people, can decide how we want the world to be and simply speak it into being that way. Unfortunately, and rather ironically, he's forgotten Foucault's point that control of knowledge is an enactment of power. If versions of truth bear no relation to anything outside of themselves, the only way to settle differences between those who claim different versions is through dominance. The imposition of gender identity ideology is a perfect example of this. The trans activist movement works by compelling people to agree to certain versions of reality. It's been so successful that many of our public institutions now operate on the basis that men can transform into women, that there are more than two sexes in humans, and that sex categories are assigned to babies on an arbitrary basis. So what does this mean for social research? Fundamentally, it means that researchers can make claims without responsibility to demonstrate that they are true. This obviously has huge implications for methodological rigour and the trustworthiness of academic output. In the last section of this talk, I'm going to consider how we could think about research differently, particularly qualitative research. In order to do this, I want to consider the basis of the constructionist critique of positivism and the mistakes constructionism has made there. Positivism assumes that the way we come to make sense of the world is by finding ways to look at it as clearly as possible and then describing what we see. Constructionists have noticed a problem with that approach. When different people look at the same thing, they describe it in different ways. That's true, but for constructionists, it means that our view of the world out there cannot be relied upon, so our knowledge cannot relate to it in any meaningful way. Let's consider the ontological and epistemological premises of positivism and constructionism to have a look at these two claims. So positivism assumes that the world is out there. We are in here behind our experiential interface, which gets in the way of seeing out there clearly. We should aim to remove as much of that interface as possible in order to get a clear image, which is possible if you apply the right method. If we think about this in terms of Plato's analogy of the cave, we can and should get out of the cave so that we can look directly at the truth. Constructionism comes along and says we cannot get out from behind the experiential interface. There is always some interpretation that mediates our experience of what is going on. The world may or may not be out there. We cannot know for sure because our experiential interface gets in the way of seeing it clearly. We should therefore accept that everything we know is constructed in our minds and has no reliable relationship with truth. In terms of Plato's cave, we cannot get out. We can only see constructed representations. What constructionism has done here is notice that our experiential interface is not something we can get rid of. This is true. We can only ever experience stuff from our own position as people. But where constructionism goes wrong is to accept the positivistic assertion that this interface is a barrier to our understanding. It has accepted the initial assumption that knowledge is separate from experiential being. If we begin with the position that our being in the world prevents us from understanding what's happening in it, rather than being the way we find out about what's happening in it, we create a problem of needing to understand how we're able to know what's happening. Both approaches assume the same basic ontology, because they imagine that idea or knowledge or mind is ontologically separate from matter or being or body. The idea-matter dualism is what has led to the constructionism positivism dualism. When we assume we're cut off from the world, we're always going to have to explain how it is that we can experience it. And the answer is we're not cut off from it. The mistake being made in both positivism and constructionism is that neither understand the researcher as being part of the world that is being researched. To take a simple example, if I walk my dog in my local park, I will encounter trees, grass, people, dogs, bins, benches, and a pond. Sorry, I've missed a bit. It's assumed in both positivism and constructionism that the way humans make meaning is looking out and creating representational pictures of the world rather than through being and interacting with it. So this is an example of that. As I'm walking around my park, I don't go along describing things to myself, but I do engage with them in a way that enables me to operate in that situation. I avoid walking into the trees. I might say hi to the people. I definitely say hi to the dogs. And if I misperceive something and interact with it inappropriately, that something will let me know. I might see something and think it's a bench, and I decide to have a little sit down. If it turns out that thing is actually a pond, my misperception is going to get corrected pretty quickly. Rocco, my dog, is also able to do this. He doesn't have language, and yet he is able to relate to the world around him in a way that suggests he's able to perceive it. And not only that, but we can relate to each other in a way that suggests we are both experiencing the same world. Concepts are not labels, they are tools. We don't use language to paint a picture of the world we see, we use it as a tool to interact with and within that world. This is why if we change the meaning of a concept, such as sex, in a way that disconnects it from the world it's being used to help navigate, it isn't useful for navigating that world. Claiming that sex doesn't exist is not only a problem because it's an inaccurate description. It's a problem because if we organise society on the basis of something that is not true, we're going to cause harm. And if we study society on the basis of something that is not true, we are going to make errors. In order to understand social processes, we need the right tools. And as Jane Clare Jones puts it in her upcoming book, when you try to replace sex with gender, you are basically telling me that I can give you my hammer and you replace it with a fish, and I can still use it to hit nails. For sociology, sex denial means removing the tool we use to analyse whole swathes of social structure and process. If we can't acknowledge sex, we can't explain male violence. If we can't acknowledge sex, we can't explain reproductive labour. If we can't acknowledge sex, we can't explain gender. And all of this happens because we're removing a tool that we need in order to interact reliably with the world. That tool is a concept. Concepts are socially constructed, but we construct them for a reason. They allow us to do things in the world. I don't know how to stop sharing. Oh, here we go.
At the top. Thank you, Rose. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And next up we have Charlotte Edun, who's an MRes student at York University here in the UK, who's going to be talking about framing the maternal body, neoliberalism, dualism, and sex difference. Okay. Oh, you're muted, Charlie.
Unmute myself. Can you see those slides? You can, great. Hi, so thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk here. My paper summarises my recently completed MRes, which interrogates how birth plans are written and deployed. Birth plans have become a rite of passage in many pregnancies in the UK. They are now recommended by a wide range of antenatal and perinatal specialists and educators, from the NCT to the NHS. They're considered to be the method by which mothers can exercise choice and retain control. However, there's an inconsistency here that suggests the purpose, role and value of the birth plan is misunderstood, and that's the starting point for my research. While birth plans are recommended, they are also maligned as being unrealistic, and the refrain, "it all goes out of the window once labour starts," is a common one. In both research and experience, we find that birth plans are not aligned with outcomes, and it's this gulf between the stated preferences of mothers and birth outcomes that is a cause of friction. Mothers who write them may be constructed as being willful and hubristic, presuming to influence a process that's culturally synonymous with loss of control. There is evidence to suggest that the presentation of a birth plan itself is associated with tensions between mothers and their care providers. So birth plans are both popular and problematic. While they are recommended in line with both strategic health policies and feminist approaches to birth, they are clearly an adjunct to clinical care protocols, which are determined within standardised national clinical guidelines. Birth plans are totemic of many of the issues within the NHS care system, including the tensions between physiological and managed birth, the hierarchical power dynamics which informs the complex and sometimes irascible discourse between mothers, midwives and medics, which is often referred to as the birth wars. In light of this, my research question was, what do mothers seek to achieve when they write their birth plan? So for those of you without a personal, professional or political association with maternity care, I'd like to offer some context for my research. Oh, hello, that slide's not changing. Let's have a look. There we go. I'd like to offer you some context for my research. The maternity care system is in crisis, and this isn't new. Maternity services in the UK have been dysfunctional and problematic for mothers and midwives for generations. Despite research evidencing the physical and emotional health benefits of physiological birth to the maternal dyad and core strategies and guidelines intended to create the conditions that support it, intervention rates continue to increase. The caesarean rate was under 10% in the year that I was born in 1976 and is now approximately 34.5% and rising. That this rate is variable by region and trust indicates that this outcome is driven by something other than female physiology. Having completed her report into failures of practice at the Shrewsbury and Telford Trust, Donna Ockenden has now been appointed to review failings at the Nottingham University's Hospitals Trust. This follows an investigation in the Morecambe Bay Trust and precedes an investigation into practice failures in East Kent. At the end of last month, the charity Birthrights released its independent report, Systemic Racism, Not Broken Bodies, identifying the risks women face when birthing while black, as activist Mars Lord describes it. My research was undertaken in the shadow of the pandemic and a 28-month period where women were, and still are, subject to limitations to intrapartum support and services. And it's not only mothers who are not being adequately served by maternity care. A decade of budget cuts has resulted in workforce shortages, cuts to CPD, strictures on the conditions required to provide care, low morale and burnout. The current 31% attrition rate for newly qualified midwives is indicative of the significant stress and pressure they are under. All this suggests a lack of political will to to improve conditions in a service which is not in fact a niche concern. 84% of women will have a baby by the time they are 45, and 100% of us are born. The picture in the UK then is one in which women and babies are surviving, but the potential for joy in what is ultimately a human experience is significantly debased. I approach this research not solely as an academic, but also as a doula, having observed the process of birth in various environments and complexities. This research is intended to have meaning that will inform adaptation and improvement of services and improve mothers' experiences. In qualitative semi-structured interviews undertaken with multiparous mothers and experienced midwives in 7 different trusts across the UK, I was able to identify 5 themes that characterise the impetus to write the birth plan. Contrary to presumptions, mothers do not write birth plans with the intention of overriding medical expertise. They seek appropriate, relational, safe care, and the birth plan is the tool they use as they attempt to access this. I'm afraid to say that this is not particularly groundbreaking research outcomes and reflects much existing research. What's more interesting is why these consistent findings have not been effectively applied to maternity strategy. And in order to draw meaningful conclusions from my research, I've sought to identify the contextual factors which have contributed to this failure. While mothers may always have planned for the perinatal period, the birth plan itself is a modern construct. An understanding of the historical milieu that birth plans arose from gives us empathy for the progenitors of what has become a somewhat controversial document. It also helps to clarify the foundational motivations and allows us to identify where broader conditions have disordered its adoption. Over 3 centuries from the Enlightenment onwards, there was a transfer of authoritative knowledge from male to female spheres. Ownership of credible knowledge about pregnancy and birth moved from the tacit, intuitive female communities of midwives who understood birth as a normal human process to the paternalistic medical model, which conceives birth as a high-risk event requiring active management. The establishment of the NHS in 1947 sealed the wholesale transfer of birth away from women and families and into the institution, with the 1971 Peel report recommending that facilities should be provided for 100% of births to happen in hospital. Simultaneously, there was pushback against institutional and state control of women's health, with the establishment in the UK of the NCT in 1956 and AIMS in 1960, and in alignment with the liberatory women's health movement in the US. So when Simpkin and Reinke published their pamphlet, Planning Your Baby's Birth, in the US in 1980, it was in the context of a concerted and determined effort by women to recover lost knowledge about and participation in their bodily processes. This is not quite the same as seeking control over the process of birth. Since then, the birth planning as envisaged by Simpkin and Reinke has been appropriated and usurped by the very patriarchal institutions it was intended to wrest control from. This appropriation of the birth plan has been possible because some of its characteristics mirror themes central to neoliberalism, which was simultaneously gaining purchase in the West. The superficial parallels provided a measure of common ground from which choice and control were defined as factors that would offer mothers access to the highest quality care and the best outcomes. On this basis, the birth plan was modelled by healthcare providers as a mutually acceptable tool via which to access this logic of choice. Through the neoliberal lens, the birth plan is understood as an aid to mothers. When healthcare is rationalised in terms of economic dynamics, the consumer, in this case mothers, must be free to exert considered and foresighted choice. And this is the recognisable characteristic of the birth plan, a form of modular planning akin to Lego. If the mother's instructions are followed and the pieces are chosen and placed in the correct way, they can be relied on to lead inexorably towards the best outcome. And it should be noted that perhaps one reason that choice and control via the birth plan was as acceptable a solution to government policymakers as it was to birth activists is that it offers the side benefit of circumventing and making more efficient the lengthy, high-time, high-cost investment of antenatal education and relational care. And this is in line with the neoliberal desire to roll back the state. In this way, the uniquely human and embodied experience of birth is framed as a straightforward form of production, subject to the same forces and pressures as the free market of products and services. However, this insistence on mediated agency and control makes mothers unduly responsible in a process which is, in truth, a communal endeavour rather than an individual pursuit, and it gives ground for both maternal guilt and cultural judgment if the best outcome is not achieved. Simultaneously, this focus on personal responsibility turns attention away from the systemic and structural issues which affect the practice of maternity care. This neoliberal correlation between good or sensible choices and a totemic healthy body echoes the disaggregation of the mind-body in the Cartesian proposition, and this heralds a fundamental mismatch between the neurohormonal psychosocial realities of the birth room and the theoretically rational navigation of the free market of healthcare. Susan Bordeaux sees this dualism as the basis for Western philosophy, which she describes as a project of disembodiment, a neat encapsulation of the aspiration to slough off the unruly body in order to attain the cool, rational objectivity of the mind. This dualism is both androcentric and the conceptual substructure for scientific modes of analysing, considering and interpreting the world within which maternity care is contained and to which maternal choice and control is opposed. This dualist model, in which female is constructed as corporeal, mechanistic and autonomic, while the male is allied with a capacity for reason and judgment, both forms and justifies medical and cultural biases which pathologise female bodies. The way that female bodies function in birth is an overt contradiction of philosophically contrived norms and standards of behaviour. Female bodies are a disruption from the norm. The healthy functioning of a female body is a problem simply because it's not what men's bodies do. It becomes a problem to be solved, to be cured and restored. Birth represents the most confronting example of this, where the leaky boundaries that Shildrick referred to in 2017 are not just conceptual, they are actual. The presence of blood, amniotic fluid, urine, faeces, tears and milk present a combination of taboos which force focus on the power of female sexuality and the opportunities and risks of reproduction. These taboos, which function to codify female bodies as potentially dangerous, and pregnancy can be understood as a particularly affronting paradox, a chimeric state where the body is neither one nor two, and where rights overlap, and questions about humanity, individual purpose coincide with existential anxiety about our mortality. So neoliberalism offers a rationale for how maternal choice and control came to be co-opted by paternal institutions and used in a way which is unhelpful to mothers. Dualistic theories of the mind and body give context for how maternal bodies are used to rationalise constructions of mothers as ignorant and their bodies as pathological. But neither in themselves are adequate to explain how this perpetuates. I propose that a rigorised theory of sex difference is valuable here, in which she proposes our existence in the world is informed in part by the materiality of our sexual difference, and further by the subtle varied psychic perspectives on and interactions with the world that sexual difference provides. And here I lean particularly on Jane Clare Jones in 2014, Laura Green in 2012, and Margaret Whitford in 1986 to illuminate the point. Particularly relevant to my thesis is a rigorised assertion that the surface the infant sees itself reflected in Lacan's psychoanalytic theory of development, and against which he realises himself as an independent sovereign being, is not in fact an inanimate mirror, but an entirely relational, foundational and interactive mother. Jones and Green both identify that in order to attain this aspiration for sovereign independence, it is necessary to erase the connection with the mother, what Green describes as severing dependence on the dangerous, engulfing and overpowering maternal body. So female bodies, particularly reproductive ones, come to represent a disruption to the entire male imaginary. Both Jones and Green identify this expunging of the maternal as a continuing symptom of dominant patriarchy. And here I'll draw together a number of strands. The male body as the standard, the Cartesian disaggregation of mind and body, the association of the female with autonomic corporeality and the male with rational judgment, the Western philosophical disembodiment described by Bordeaux, and the rationalism exhorted by neoliberalism. It is in this light that mothers can be constructed as ignorant, able to hear their bodies but not interpret them, and it's in this light that mothers' perinatal needs can be positioned as secondary to paternalistic models and metrics of care. In this way, maternal intentions to write and enact a birth plan can be constructed as willful and hubristic. I contend that this is a significant factor in the cultural, intellectual and physical incursion of the male imaginary into what is judiciously a female space, and its disruptive insertion into cultures of birth which would otherwise vertically connect generations of women. I propose that the male imaginary holds authority over and controls birth, but cannot conceive of what is necessary to accommodate this normal human process salutogenically, nor to encompass the relational care that mothers repeatedly define as important to them. Recognition of the implications of these let's try that again, epistemological sex difference stereotypes are central to understanding the biases against female bodies which underpin how science and medicine conceptualise, construct and anticipate female bodies. They underpin practices which prevent mothers from accessing the modalities of care they want, regardless of the autonomy, choice and control the neoliberal birth plan promises. These are the systemic and structural biases which make maternal choice and control illusory and relational care largely unattainable. Instead, we've fostered a maternity care system which is largely in opposition to the physiological and emotional needs of mothers in birth, in its fragmentation, bureaucratisation, and overwhelming focus on measurable outcomes rather than experience. It is notable that in the last month, the Ockenden report has failed to identify the systemic issues which underpin problematic practice and is making recommendations that perpetuate the paternalism of the last 40 years. In light of this, I conclude that while the neoliberal birth plan may be framed as reflecting feminist values, particularly those that relate to bodily autonomy and control, in fact, it mischaracterises the form of dynamic, safe and relational support and control that mothers desire. Further, in turning away from the effects of systemic and structural influences on birth experience and making mothers responsible for their own destiny, it can be considered to be a particular challenge to women's health and well-being.
Thanks. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And finally, we've got Amy, who's very kindly joining us from Australia, where I think it's some point quite late in the evening. Amy is a research officer at Victoria University in Australia, and is going to be talking about the limitations of networked feminism, a critical look at Reddit's 2X chromosomes subreddit.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you to Open University's Gender Critical Research Network for having me tonight here in Australia, and also for everyone who has come along to listen to our presentations. My name's Amy Mowle. I am a media and communications researcher, currently working on a transdisciplinary research program at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. I'm currently waiting on the conferral of my PhD thesis, and I'd like to share with you some of the findings that emerged from that research today. So at the heart of my doctoral project was a desire to understand the extent to which the internet and its associated technologies has played a role in shaping the political and social participation. I was particularly interested in the role these technologies have played in the formation of the socially networked forms of feminism that have emerged from the online environment. I sought to explore this relationship through a case study of one of the largest online English language forums dedicated to the discussion of women's issues, which is Reddit's 2X chromosomes. 2X chromosomes is one of over 130,000 distinct communities or subreddits that make up the social news platform Reddit. It's a lively and active community that advertises itself as a welcoming environment that prioritizes the perspectives of women from all walks of life. Members of 2X chromosomes can post content to the community in the form of text, video, or images, and users can then comment on this content or reply to the comments made by their peers, and this generates threads of conversation. Analysis of these conversations revealed a networked feminist community that's tangled up with the neoliberal values of individualism and competition. And this seems to result in feminist practice that simultaneously offers very little in the way of structural critique, but also works to undermine those voices that challenge the community's dominant narratives. To illustrate this, I'll start by sketching out what I understand to be the dominant culture driving online participation in today's internet, before providing an example of how this culture is reproduced in the participatory practices of the 2X chromosomes community. I'll finish up by discussing how this process results in a sterilized form of feminist thought and practice that in some ways works to bolster the patriarchal structures of power and privilege that characterize our lives more broadly, but also delegitimize the critical contributions of dissenting feminist voices, both within and outside the 2X chromosomes community. So when talking about the internet, it's important to recognize that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The exact same social conditions and mechanisms of power that exert influence over our offline world similarly impact our ability to navigate and meaningfully participate in the online world. So rather than neutral spaces for unrestricted self-expression, social media platforms like Reddit should be thought of as comprising part of a broader economic, political, and social system that I would argue is subordinate to the logic of neoliberalism. Beyond the free market economics and reduction of the welfare state, neoliberalism produces a citizenry that is entrepreneurial and productive and self-optimizing. Failure to thrive under a neoliberal economic system is attributed to the individual rather than being the outcome of a culmination of broader structural inequalities. So social media platforms reward their users for successfully transforming themselves into a marketable commodity. Users are pitted against each other as they attempt to secure attention, that finite and valuable resource upon which so much of one's digital success depends. So in other words, social media incentivizes users to behave in particular ways and say particular things in order to attract attention and generate engagement. This in turn generates profit for the .com businesses that own the platforms themselves. All of this culminates in a neoliberal digital culture that rewards individualism, encourages competition, and promotes rampant consumerism across almost all forms of social media participation. And so it goes without saying that the members of network feminist communities like 2X Chromosomes are not immune to the demands of a neoliberal digital culture. In fact, the analysis of conversational data extracted from 2X Chromosomes reveals that this neoliberal digital culture encourages and even reproduces certain practices that appear to be antithetical to the emancipatory goals of feminism. This includes a limited form of political participation via a highly individualized moments of self-disclosure, and the vilification of those who hold perspectives considered to challenge the neoliberal status quo. So I'm sure everyone is aware, in the early 70s, the slogan, "The personal is political," was used to reframe the day-to-day experiences of women as being deeply rooted in gender inequality. For these feminists, personal experience provided a valuable source of information about the extent of women's subjugation and was thus shared in order to locate the threads of oppression that were common across the female experience. At first glance, it would appear that members of 2X Chromosomes are encouraged to engage in a similar form of sharing. However, on closer look, although the dataset is dominated by moments of individualized self-disclosure, the vast majority of these contributions lack the element of critique that characterize this second wave practice. Instead, participants are rewarded via inter-community approval for sharing highly individualized and often emotionally driven anecdotal experiences that are divorced from any broader structural analysis. Moreover, the sharing of these anecdotes tends to attract further individualized contributions. So rather than generating a conversation about what these experiences might mean or why it is they're relevant to contemporary feminism, you just have people sort of sharing their version of events back and forth. The value placed on depoliticized exposition by the 2X Chromosomes community points to the pervasiveness of a neoliberal digital culture that works to position the inviolability of the individual over the good of the collective. And this is perhaps most salient for those self-disclosure posts that center the participant's personal choice, perspective, or preference. Such contributions rarely, if ever, critique or interrogate are critiqued or interrogated by other members of the community, and instead tend to be valorized as expressions of empowerment by way of choice feminist rhetoric. As a result, practices that could be seen as potentially contributing to the reproduction of oppressive power structures are frequently inverted and misrecognized as markers of feminist empowerment. A prevalent example of this misrecognition can be found in the self-congratulatory conversations detailing the experiences of women who choose to engage in the kinds of risky sexual behaviors that have traditionally reflected male sexual fantasy. Rather than triggering a broader conversation about the subordination of women's sexual experiences to the desires of men, contributions that appear to detail the exploits of a sexually empowered woman are overwhelmingly met with uncritical inter-community support. So this process of tying ideas about sexual empowerment to individual choice ultimately produces a political stagnation, as women are discouraged from debating or criticizing these positions lest they be deemed a bad feminist. In fact, those few positions that do offer critical perspectives on the issue are often disregarded as being out of touch or ignored completely. This process of rejecting these critical contributions that challenge the community's dominant narratives ultimately undermines the interrogation of these broader structural issues that to varying degrees continue to impact the lives of women the world over. One example that highlights the widespread rejection of dissenting perspectives can be found in the normative discourses around sex and gender that afford a degree of centrality within the 2X chromosomes community. The community's ideological position on gender is made clear from the outset. In a post pinned to the community's landing page, a moderator of the community explicitly states that trans women are women and TERFs can F right off. An acronym for trans exclusionary radical feminist, the term TERF is regularly weaponized in order to silence criticisms levied at the expansion of transgender rights and subsequent dissolution of the protections and spaces that have traditionally been reserved for natal-born women. The term is most frequently used as a slur against women who hold these perspectives and is often accompanied by threats of assault, rape, and murder. By using this term in official communications, the 2X chromosomes moderation team subtly contributes to its normalization and validates the ongoing efforts to silence and dehumanize the women that are publicly challenging this singular narrative. Moreover, the vitriolic framing of this issue works to discourage some kind of genuine participation of individuals that do hold conflicting perspectives. And the effects of rejecting this critical interrogation and debate that's necessary for the progression of feminist thought is twofold. First, it works to naturalize support for transgender ideology as a just and inherently feminist position on the popular stage. And second, it works to delegitimize gender-critical feminist perspectives beyond the scope of 2X chromosomes through a process of demonizing, alienating, and othering those who hold them. Ultimately, this creates the illusion of a singular coherent feminist narrative of sex and gender, and ultimately undermines a key element of feminist ideology in action, that of sex-based oppression and exploitation. These examples really embody a broader trend towards the erosion of collective politics in network feminist communities in favor of an economically productive and depoliticized popular feminism that works to uphold the central tenets of neoliberal rationality. Given the sheer size and scope of the 2XC community, implications for diverse feminist political participation are deeply concerning, but further critical research into other popular network feminist communities is necessary.
Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you, Amy. So if anyone has questions, we've got about just under 15 minutes left. If you can raise your hand using the reactions tab, because we don't have the chat enabled in this meeting, so any questions? So Mary.
Thanks to all of you. Really, really interesting talks. Can you hear me okay? So I don't know if this is a question or just me wanting to share my own stories, but it's Charlie's talk that I wanted to ask about, because I'm not sure I've fully taken everything on board from what you said, but one thing that worries me about the presentation of birth care is there's a tendency to try and put up two pillars. There's the male medical model and the female midwife-led natural model. and to push people either to one or the other, with a strong tendency to say to women, well, you should go for the female natural led one. So just to tell you a bit about my own experiences of childbirth. So my second son was, he was a footling breech. And when I went to the hospital, I was faced very much with this. I had a midwife on one side and a medical doctor on the other trying to tell me what to do. And the midwife was very much trying to encourage me to have a go at a natural delivery, and saying, you know, it's only we've lost this knowledge, but people in the developing world do it all the time, and it's fine. And then I had a kind of slightly horrified look on the medical doctor on the other side, saying, well, you know, I'd recommend a section. And this was my second child. My first child had been slightly sideways on coming out, and that had meant interventions. It had meant I'd have to have AVA or two. So I thought, there's no way I'm going to try to naturally birth this breech baby. So I didn't. So I went for the section, and it was very much presented as, well, this is your empowered choice, right? You're doing this, in the kind of neoliberal model that you talk about. But I came out with my healthy baby from having given birth to this child with a section, and the midwife was wheeling me out to the recovery suite, and a passing doctor said, oh, congratulations to me, seeing me there with my new baby. And the midwife said, well, oh, not really, it was a section. You know, you are meant to, if you're a proper woman, you're meant to do it the natural way. So I just wondered what your feeling was on that framing. Well, on the one hand, wanting presumably to embrace the idea that there are better ways than just the medical model, but on the other hand, the suggestion that real women do the natural birth seems wrong too. So
you won't be surprised to learn, Mary, I have many thoughts on this. I think that tendency to ideologically position one thing as better than the other, I think it is sort of reflects what Green describes as the phallic binary within the male imaginary. You know, that things have to be hierarchical, it has to be one thing or another. And what that reflects is this drive to create a one-size-fits-all solution for all women. And of course, that's not possible. It also positions birth as being the same for all women, and of course it's not the same for all women, because all women arrive in the birth room bringing with them not only their own positionality in terms of age or health or socio-demographic positioning and all of the complexities around that, but also their own experiences of their own bodies. So it's, you know, it's not a straightforward picture, and I absolutely think that ideological positioning of one thing as better than the other, it is extremely problematic. I mean, that's the very definition of the birth wars. What we often see, and that point I was making about the data around the increase in caesarean births in, I'm very old, 46 years since I've been around, you know, from under 10% to now 35% and rising. That's an example of what Alice Drager describes as maximinning. So what they're doing is what medics have a tendency to do upon women's bodies, rather than in agreement with women, is to use the maximum number of interventions in order to decrease the potential likelihood of harm. Now, for some women that's completely acceptable, and for other women it won't be. But the critical point, and this I think is the big thing that's missing in the Ockenden report, is there's no discussion with women, and you can't get that if you don't have relational care. And you can't have relational care unless you have some form of continuity of care, and that is one of her recommendations, is to do away with continuity. So we're not in a better position, and you know, you are, I don't know how old your second child is, but you that sort of conversation is still happening for women in our care currently.
Thank you.
Anna.
It's a really quick point. I'm a midwife, and one of the things we're doing at the moment is moving away from the terms natural birth, sometimes physiological, but there's this term optimal birth, and that's really about the relationality that Charlie's talking about. An optimal birth is what you describe. You're aware of the situation, and you, with your caregivers, made that decision to go for the C-section, you know. And so that's just in terms of kind of language, that those of us who are women-centered midwives, that's one of the terms that we use.
Thank you. Rose, do you have a question? You're muted.
Can I ask a question for Amy?
Yes.
I just want, that was so incredibly interesting, and you covered loads of things that I've been thinking about and wondering about and thinking someone needs to research this, so hooray. I was wondering whether you have thoughts about the way in which Reddit in particular, but also probably, I would suggest probably some other things like Twitter, but in particular Reddit is designed, that is the way that it's designed, does it make it impossible to do collective political organising effectively on it? And is there have you got any thoughts about ways in which the internet design could be different, to not just enable that neoliberal communication, but enable a more collectivised kind of communication?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And something that I think really these platforms and the internet, you know, more broadly, they're really just tools. How do I explain this? So maybe I should start with what does exist. There's a platform, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, called Over It. And that's basically where all of the gender critical feminists that were using Reddit ended up after they all got kicked off. So that doesn't have any sort of financial imperative or profit motive behind it. So I think that as soon as you introduce this sort of motivation to keep shareholders happy and keep the common denominator as pleased with what's going on as possible, then introducing perspectives that maybe make some people uncomfortable or raise a bit of criticism to the status quo are not going to survive in these kinds of platforms for very long. So I think that the way that the internet as we know it, it's pretty much impossible to do anything without coming into contact with one of the major .com companies. That's just the nature of it, the way things are these days. I don't think that the way things are, these mainstream platforms offer too much in the way of organizing politically, without having, I think, the eventual bleed over from, you know, the motivations that are driving the platforms themselves. As long as you're not a pest, you'll probably be okay. But as soon as the things that you're talking about or organizing for start to undermine these broader structures of power, then I believe that's when you sort of get shafted off.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? So I have one for Rose. Oh, Yolanda. Yolanda, I think you're muted.
Sorry. When Charlotte was talking about the binary of the birth plan, I thought about, you know, a third way. And I know when I wrote a birth plan, I looked at it as really a process of educating myself about birth and sort of coming through to the other side. There was a lot happening when I wrote my own birth plan, but I think that rather than seeing a birth plan as something that creates this tension between, you know, the caregivers and the woman, I'm looking at it as a document where the woman informs herself about birth, and that seems to not have come through with what you discussed today. And I know that you're working as a doula, and I've worked in birth advocacy as well. That's the avenue. So, you know, taking from a birth plan going out the window. My husband's a civil engineer and he's ex-Royal Marine, and he always says that in battle, you know, you go in with a plan and the plan is destroyed at first contact. So it's the information that we take into the birth is what educates us and helps us to make a more informed decision than going in. And you know, I'm completely aware that birth plans have been weaponized by staff, where it becomes a tick box to say, okay, we've done this. You know, I know positives and negatives about birth plans and how they're approached by hospitals, by women, by doulas, by midwives, and on and on. But for me, it doesn't become a neoliberal document. It becomes something that has, you know, taken me, you know, it takes me with confidence into the next step.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what Simkin and Ranker had intended when they wrote that. Was that it was a process of education which formed part of a model of relational care with midwives. I think the challenge with it is that within a neoliberal environment, it has become weaponized exactly as you describe. And therefore, it's very difficult for women who are writing birth plans because they don't actually know what it's for, because it exists in a vacuum. And they know from the experience of their peers and their own experiences of childbirth that in and of itself it holds very little value. Its only meaning is as part of education and relation, really.
Thank you. We've just got 1 minute left, so I've got a question for Rose, which is, I think you gave a very good critique of the kind of mainstream certainly in sociology and social sciences, and you kind of pitted positivism against social constructionism. Just wondered if you looked at kind of any of the kind of stuff that falls somewhere in the middle, kind of particularly I was thinking phenomenology, which is very much an approach which is about how we approach and encounter the world through our bodies and through the senses. So yeah.
So I've looked quite a lot at, okay, briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about phenomenology and a little bit about critical realism. Mm-hmm. So critical realism, first of all, I think critical realism is equivalent kind of approach in terms of like it comes with a particular ontological and epistemological set of assumptions, which is basically that the world does exist out there and we are in here behind our eyes, and that we can remove some of the experiential interface to see some of it and come up with some ideas about what's there and test those ideas against other things we can see. So critical realism is a massive improvement on constructionism in my opinion, but I think that it relies on the same basic dualism. Phenomenology, on the other hand, is some types of phenomenology, which are based on particularly Heidegger, don't. So the basis of like Heidegger is being in the world. So I think what I want to argue and what I want to move towards is forms of qualitative research that embrace that in a very, very conscious way, that being in the world is how we're finding out about the world. Because I find that certainly with teaching of undergraduates and postgraduates, so I recently did a social research master's, and so I've read lots of like methodological literature that's aimed at research students basically, and you just don't get a decent grounding in different types of phenomenology in my experience and how to actually use that in research, and so I feel like I've had to teach myself that in a lot of ways, and you just continue to get this dualistic approach again and again and again. So yeah, I think like the development of this work that I presented today would definitely be linking that into different strands of phenomenology and how that all links together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think often in research teaching as well, you don't get phenomenology, you get IPA, and that's it. And you don't actually learn about Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty or any of the underpinnings.
Exactly.
Excellent. So that brings us to the end of today. Thank you so much to the three of you for such interesting and thought-provoking talks. And thank you to everybody for attending. And thank you to those who've been to other seminars we've done this term as well. We've had a really productive and wide-ranging set of speakers, and we will be taking this up again next year. So if you haven't signed up to the mailing list, please do go onto our website and you can see our email address there, and then you'll get notifications of all the upcoming seminars next year. But in the meantime, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great summer.
Thank you, Laura.